Well, welcome, Falcon AeroLab. I'm Mark Hyatt. I'm the founder of this venture. And we're in our 5th year, and we've almost doubled again this year. I don't know if it was COVID that drove all the parents away from schools and into homeschools, but we're close to 600 students statewide with campuses in Grand Junction, up near Greeley, Castle Rock. We're going to move, finally, after 5 years, I'm comfortable moving into the Denver metro area. So if you have any friends up there, we're looking at Erie and a campus near Park Meadows Mall. I've avoided Denver for reasons I'd rather not go into right now, but we're going to slowly, I feel comfortable going in there now. So anyway, welcome. I know we had about 70 signed up, so a lot of people got sick. They called, but we've got a lot of people live streaming from around the state, so thank you for live streaming in. And let me just tell you, I met Connie Engel. When did you get to Willie? 1977? Yeah, because dial back in America, the first African-American pilots went through a program called the Tuskegee Airmen in Tuskegee, Alabama. And my wife, who just walked in the back, her dad was an instructor pilot when all the instructors were white and all the students were black, very segregated. But these guys did a great job, and they went over into the war in World War II, and they did a super job. They were the pioneers, and they paved the way. Connie Engel was the pioneer for women because she was in the first class, and she was the top student in the first class. And I know that because I was one of the instructors there in Arizona, and I remember her walking around the flight line and getting into her T-37 and T-38. But anyway, it was a different world back then. Even in the mid-'70s, when I got into the Air Force in '74, if you got pregnant, your career was terminated. I mean, it's a whole different world. And then the stuff that went on, and the way guys talked and everything, it was a whole different world. And I'm so glad that Connie and her husband, Rich, were willing to tolerate that. And I hope they get to share some of the exciting stuff of being a pioneer and being one of the first women. So just real quick, Connie was a registered nurse, an OBGYN nurse practitioner. And Rich, I think, encouraged her to apply for pilot training. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. He's always been the wind beneath her wings. Of course, we didn't know that because we were all in our 20s back there in Arizona at Williams Air Force Base. But she was the top graduate, got the Commander's Trophy, the Leadership Award. She won everything. And back then, women weren't allowed to go to fighters, or she would have had her choice of any airplane in the Air Force. But she became a supersonic jet trainer, T-38 instructor pilot. That was the top she could do back then. And she did that when we were instructors at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona. And then she went over to Edwards Air Force Base, where Rich was a test pilot, and she flew chase on. She's going to tell you about some of the amazing experiences she got to do there. So that's basically, she's a retired lieutenant colonel now. She's a Gulfstream pilot and flies Christian ministry people all over the world. She'll tell you about that. I mean, my gosh, amazing. And her most important job is she raised 3 daughters, or they raised 3 daughters, homeschooled them from preschool to 12th grade. They all went to Christian colleges. And I mean, I'm just in awe of you guys. I mean, you're well, anyway. And Rich, I'm not going to say too much about him because he's, you know, it's funny, when I met their daughter, Lindsay, and I didn't know she was Connie's daughter, she said, "Oh, you must know my dad, Rich Engel." Assumed that because I was a fighter pilot. I said, "No, I don't know Rich, but with the name of Engel, is your mom Connie?" And she says, "Yeah." I said, "I know your mom. I don't know your dad." So she was pretty shocked at that. But the more I've gotten to know Rich, amazing. You know, he's a fighter pilot, test pilot, 2-star general. And I think I mentioned before that 1% of the second lieutenants that come in the Air Force make 1-star general. And I'm sure it's 0.5% make 2-star general. So he's in a very rarefied atmosphere. But his most important job has been being the wind beneath Connie's wings. So I'm going to hand off now to Connie and Rich. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Well, first of all, I have to thank Mark for setting up an organization like this so that you have opportunities to listen to people, tell their stories, and you have great education. Homeschooling is just amazing. So thank you, and thank you parents for bringing the students here and everybody that's come in online that is listening to this. I appreciate you sacrificing your school time to listen to us today. My journey with aviation kind of reminded me of a story of this general and his wife, and they were traveling cross country in their car, and they stopped in this little gas station in the middle of nowhere. And General gets out and he goes in, and the wife's sitting out there, and the guy comes out to pump the gas, and General looks out and hears the wife and this guy just laughing and joking and hands raising and hugging, and he's going, wow, what is this? So a little bit later he gets in the car, they drive off, and he says, you know, it looked like you knew that guy. And she said, know that guy? I almost married that guy. He was my high school honey. And so they drove a little bit longer, and nobody said anything, and finally the general says, you know, I bet you're sitting there thinking, if I'd married that guy, I'd be living at that little house next to the gas station in the middle of nowhere. She says, no. Actually, I was thinking, if I married that guy, you'd be sitting in the gas station in the middle of nowhere, and he'd be a general officer.
No comment.
Everybody that accomplishes anything in life has people in their lives that help them get there. And my husband was one in my life. And parents bring you to places like this. They encourage you. They pay a lot of money for you to get some education. Parents will just raise you with the right standards and the right visions to help you accomplish what God has put in your heart. And there are teachers that will teach you academics and teach you great things that will help you to get where you're going. There are instructor pilots that will help you through the crazy time when you're trying to learn how to fly an airplane. And there are mentors that will come along beside you and show you the way and tell you stories that encourage you. And then there are role models. And the role models that we have for you today are from my family. We're going to tell you stories from, well, next slide, and I'll show you here. Up in the left is my husband. He was a test pilot, and he was going to tell you a little bit about being at Edwards. He actually rose over the years to be the commander of Edwards Air Force Base, in charge of all the test airplanes out there, which is pretty awesome. And today he flies our Diamond as a hobby. We have a little Diamond 40, and he flies that as a hobby. Picture down on the left lower is myself in the Air Force. I'm going to tell you a little bit about being an Air Force pilot when I was there. And then the one in the back seat there was my daughter, who is now a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. And she's going to tell you a little bit about being an active duty pilot today. Up on the right-hand side is myself and Shelley sitting in the cockpit of a Gulfstream. And like Mark said, I fly a Gulfstream now internationally with several pastors, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And then Shelley is a commercial pilot, and she came up through the civilian training business and into commercial aviation, so she's going to tell you about that. And then my third daughter, which is our middle daughter, she's also a pilot. She's a pilot for hobby. She doesn't get paid for her job, but she's been traveling all over the world with her job, and she finds her heights in different ways than we do. So with that, next slide,
please. Okay, this is we're going to play a clip of Lindsay's story. It's a video that Lindsay took, and we're going to play it for you, and then I'll quickly go over some slides to show you some pictures of what the airplane she talked about. Steve?
Hey everybody, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lindsay Engel. I am the commander of the 921st Contingency Response Squadron at Travis Air Force Base in California. I'm also a C-17 pilot. I was born in Virginia, but moved to California when I was about 6 months old, out to Edwards Air Force Base, California. And that's primarily where I grew up, just surrounded by planes. Obviously, both my parents were Air Force pilots. So some of my childhood memories include the dinner time conversations, talking about flying, my mom picking me up from the playground in her flight suit. I remember a couple years later, we moved away and then we came back to Edwards, which is the huge test center for planes. And so there's a ton of different aircraft there, but it's out in the desert. And I remember sitting in class in high school and hearing the sonic booms. So anytime an aircraft breaks the sound barrier. There's just this huge boom that you hear, and it's not allowed in most places in the U.S., but out at the training place it is. So we would sit in
called it
class
the sound
and
of
hear
freedom.
all the time, boom, boom, boom. It was just kind of a regular thing that I actually miss hearing those. So I grew up with that, and you know, I kind of went through my rebellious phase. I would say I wanted to be a veterinarian for a while, and then I decided, no, I think I'm going to be a lawyer. So I went to Oral Roberts University. I majored in computer engineering, and I was going to go to law school after that and get into patent law. So after 4 years of school, I decided I was just tired of school and I didn't want to go to school anymore. And I missed the Air Force, I missed being around aviation, I missed the planes, and so I decided to join the Air Force. And so I did that, but I came in as an Air Battle Manager, an ABM. So an ABM is kind of like an air traffic controller, but instead of bringing the planes apart, you try to bring them together. So if you want to do air refueling, you bring the receiver to the tanker. We would vector them together because we have this big airborne radar. You sit in the back of the plane and you control the planes that are out there. So I did that for a couple of years, and then I decided I should really just embrace my roots, and I wanted a window, and I wanted to be the one flying. And so I decided I wanted to go ahead and actually be a pilot finally. I got my private pilot's license in Florida at Tyndall Air Force Base in Panama City. I got about 40 hours in a Cessna 172, and that was all external to the Air Force. I just kind of did that on the side. And so I got that, and then I applied for the Air Force's active duty program for flying. And I was selected, and I attended pilot training down in Del Rio, Texas, Laughlin Air Force Base. So my first plane in the Air Force was the T-6. It's our primary trainer, single engine prop, but it's a jet engine. So it's the prop on a jet engine, and it's just this absolutely overpowered go-kart. So much fun to fly. Fully aerobatic. You could do loops. We did spins. We did formation flying. Lots of low level and instruments, and it was just an absolute blast. We get about 6 months in the T6, so about 100 hours, and then we move on. So I moved to the T1, which is a business jet really that we've modified to be a primary kind of instrument trainer. And so I flew the T1. I think it was about another 100 hours, and so we do a lot more instrument type of flying, but we also do some simulated air refueling, simulated airdrop, like what we're going to fly when we move to our follow-on aircraft. And so after that, I went to the C-17, which was my primary aircraft, and I flew the C-17 at Charleston, about 1,500 hours in that. Got to see the whole world. I did a lot of, obviously, trips to the Middle East and the desert, but I also went down to South America and did a whole bunch of different missions down there, a couple to Asia, and then of course a ton over Europe as well. The C-17, if you're not familiar with, it's just a huge cargo plane, 4 jet engines, turbofans. It's the primary plane that did the recent evacuations out of Afghanistan. So we carry lots of cargo, but also obviously personnel. We also do aeromedical evacuations, so we can bring on the medical folks and they turn the whole back of the plane into a hospital, and it's really impressive. So we can do emergency evacuations of folks that need medical care. So I did 3 different deployments in the C-17. I did one to Kyrgyzstan, which is a super cold country over, it's a former Soviet Union country, really cold, but we did a lot of trips from there in and out of Afghanistan. And then I did some time at Incirlik in Turkey, and it was the same. We did a lot of trips down to Iraq from there, and then I did some time at Doha, Qatar. Al Udeid is our primary base there, where we stage out of to do a lot of stuff in and out of Afghanistan and Iraq. So I did those. It was a blast. I learned so much just about airmanship and flying. And after that, I needed some time off from being gone all the time, and so I went to the Air Force Academy, and I taught cadets to fly in the T-53, which is the Cirrus SR-20. that we've modified a little bit to fly at high altitude. And so I taught cadets for a while there, which was a lot of fun, just kind of some basic, very raw, no instruments or anything, just basic flying. It was really fun. And then after that, I came here to Travis, and now I'm flying part-time in the C-17. So I guess one of the questions I'm supposed to answer is, what do you think is the most important attribute to flying? I think it's hard to pin down one. I think that task management is really important. So I think obviously the ability to prioritize a lot of things going on at the same time is important, and then being able to maintain that calm demeanor under stress, because you just never know what's going to get thrown at you while you're flying. So those kind of combination of things. And then my advice to you, those that are pursuing aviation, I would say that it's a long road. It's a long road and it's a lot of work, but it's absolutely worth it. It's so fun. It's a great job. There's nothing like just taking off and kind of escaping the world behind you, and being able to travel and see the world. It's amazing. So stick with it, and be patient and persevere, and it'll all pay off in the end. Thanks.
Terrific. Let me quickly go over with you some of the pictures that that Lindsay talked about for her flying experience. This is the T6. She flew this both as a student in pilot training, and she flew it as an instructor. When she was an instructor at Shepherd, she didn't mention that. Next slide, Steve. This is the T1, which was used for training multi-engine crews. Partially through the current undergraduate pilot training program, students go into this airplane to prepare for airplanes that may have more than one pilot, several pilots in them. And she did that and went to the C-17. Next slide. This is the C-17 that she talked about, Air Force premier transport airplane, big, carries lots of stuff. I could tell you all kinds of war stories about it at Edwards, but it's really been a success. And then finally, next slide, this is the T-53, which is the airplane she flew here at the Air Force Academy. You probably see those flying around periodically, making all kinds of noise, but that's what they are. It's exactly as she described it, a fun airplane to fly. I've got two videos to show you really quick. The first one, and let me give a little background. Lindsay's current job is a CRS commander, Combat Readiness Squadron Commander. Her folks go out and prepare unprepared places, or places that aren't secure, for C-17s to come in and land and to rescue people, or put crews up, put armed forces on the ground, or to take them out. So the CRS mission is really important to get the mobility the United States needs for its geopolitical mission. Play the next slide. This is a C-17 landing on one of these unprepared runways. It's just awesome. It is landing in dirt. And Steve, you can play the next video. Of course, it can't stay there. It has to get ready to leave. So they also have the capability of taking off at those unprepared surfaces. Tell you a little story about that at Edwards. First time we did that, we damaged all 4 engines. Then we learned we needed to make a little bit of design changes to the airplane, which we did, and mastered this ability. So taking off in the dirt is never a smart thing to do, unless they know how to do it. Okay, next slide.
I know it was a little bit hard to hear when Lindsay was talking, so if you have any questions at the end, I'm sure Rich can answer questions about the C-17 or tell you some stories. We've heard a lot of them there. This is a picture of Lindsay and I last year when Randolph decided to dedicate the conference room where they decided to train women pilots. They asked us to come down there for the dedication, and so I said, can I get a ride in a T-38? And they said yes. So I actually got to go down there. My son-in-law flew front seat, I flew back seat, and Lindsay flew on my wing, and we got to go out and do all kinds of acrobatics and fun things. So there are some perks to being known.
Next slide. Okay, what we're going to do now is play the story from our youngest daughter, Shelley, who's currently flies as a first officer for SkyWest. Play the
Maybe we
videos.
could turn it up a little bit.
Hi friends, my name is Shelley Engel and I'm a first officer at SkyWest Airlines. I fly the CRJ based out of Denver. And I'm going to talk to you today a little about how I got here, where I hope to go, and maybe some of the lessons that I learned along the way. So I grew up in a home with 2 Air Force pilot parents, and I wouldn't say that we were forced or even really encouraged to go the aviation route. It was just something that they were both really passionate about. And so me and my sisters all kind of found our own way to love aviation, even though it didn't quite mirror their career choices. So I grew up in an Air Force home, was born in Virginia, moved around a lot, ended up in Lynchburg, Virginia, where I went to college for aviation. I actually had a scholarship given to me to do ROTC at the University of Virginia. And I quickly realized after I started doing the ROTC program and flying that I didn't like it. And that was kind of a big shock to me. I thought, well, of course I'll love this. My parents love it. And the ROTC thing was just not for me at all. And I actually didn't really like flying. So I went home after 1 semester and told my dad that I was going to quit and I was going to be a kindergarten teacher. And he came back to me and said, okay, you can be whatever you want to be, but you've already started down this process, so I want you to at least finish your private pilot's license. And being 17, I got really mad at him. I said, you just want me to do what you want me to do, and you know, you're forcing me into this. And now, I was going to say 13, 14 years later, I've learned that it was a variable life lesson about finishing what you start. But back then I was a little annoyed, but begrudgingly I continued on. And then I soloed and realized, well, this is kind of cool. And then I got my private pilot's license and thought, well, this is really cool. I really actually love this. I did not choose to go the military route. I found myself in aviation management. So I helped start a company in Virginia, and we were doing first flight school management, so small Cessna single engine type things, and then we went into jet management, where we would manage jets for personal owners. I did that for many years. I had gone through at college and got my commercial pilot's license, which means that I could have worked for flying, although I chose not to. I just flew on the side for fun for many years. And then fast forward to 2016, and I was back in aviation doing drone business. It was kind of right when the drones became popular, and so I started doing an aerial mapping company, still flying on the side for fun, and I ended up getting my multi-engine rating, and that kind of relit the fire of flying in me, and I decided that I wanted to pursue a full-time flying position. So I got out of the businesses that I was in, and I did an accelerated course for my CFI in Addison, Texas. And the next day got hired in Boulder, Colorado, Broomfield, Colorado, to teach as an instructor. Brand new, didn't bring a lot of teaching experience to the table, but thankfully I did have 10 years of flying under my belt, so that helped a little bit. I taught for 2 or 3 years, earning more ratings. I got my instrument instructor, my multi-engine instructor, and then eventually I got the call that I had an interview at SkyWest right around the time I hit 1,500 hours. So I went to SkyWest. I've been here for 3 years. I love it. It is a great place, and I'm learning a lot as I go. I'm on my way to upgrade to captain here pretty soon, and then I would eventually really like to fly for Southwest. So a couple things. One of my favorite flying stories in that whole process was back in 2012 when I was just doing flying for fun, and I was doing a humanitarian trip down to Eleuthera in the Bahamas. It was you fly your airplane in, and then you volunteer your time to help with hurricane recovery efforts. So we took supplies down, and then we also did some work in the helping fix up homes as we were down there. And I was flying with a local on one of our days off, and we were going to lunch somewhere, and he says, I'll give you directions. I say, okay. So we take off, and he says, okay, fly to the end of these islands and turn right. And when we see land, that's where we're going. And I was like, no GPS? No, all right. But we made it. We had a wonderful lunch at a very rocky, small runway out in the middle of the Bahamas. So that was a cool experience. Another thing that I've done along the way is I got my seaplane rating. That was really fun. My dad and I flew up to Michigan and did that together. So that was neat. If I had to give a piece of advice from where I am now, I would say enjoy the process. Every step will look a lot different, but they all have things that you can really enjoy and you won't get in the next step. For example, when I flight instructed, I had a great community of friends and a lot of people that helped answer my questions and helped make me a better pilot and helped me enjoy life. And then I got to the airlines and I really lost the community because you fly with someone and you may never fly with them again. So not that that's bad. I enjoy meeting new people, but it's very different. And so each step along the way will look a little different, but don't be in such a hurry to just get to the next step that you miss the process of really living your life as you're in it. So that would be my number one piece of advice. And that's about all the time I have. I have to go fly. See ya.
All right. Now, this picture is the picture of our Diamond 40. When Shelley was going through training, we actually purchased this airplane after she had made the commitment to fly, fortunately. And there's a story behind, he said I could do whatever I wanted to. Wasn't exactly accurate, but okay, different story. But this is the airplane she flew for most of her training, and we still own this airplane. It's stationed out in Colorado Springs, and every once in a while I sneak out and go fly it, and every once in a while Shelley comes down and goes and flies it. Next slide. Shelley mentioned that she was flying in a CRJ. This is a picture of a CRJ. This happens to have Delta paint job on it. I think the other ones she flies also have United coverings on them. Next slide. This is Shelley landing at Denver. And just by coincidence, one of her friends was flying overhead in a helicopter when this SkyWest airplane landed, and he took a picture. That's a picture of her landing right smack on the center line, something I have never yet been able to do. And it was pretty kind of cool, so we kept it. Next slide. Shelley also talked about flying to the Bahamas, and this is a picture looking out the wing of the Diamond, and you can see the color of the water. It's just this pretty blue as she was flying over the Bahamas. Next slide. This is Shelley and I on the flight to Minnesota, where she got her seaplane license, and it was also a Diamond that we flew from Denver to Minnesota. Next slide. And this is what the airplane really looked like. It was really amazing. She had what we would call in the business a crusty old guy for an instructor pilot. And he really pushed her to make sure she could fly that airplane correctly. And then FAA gave her a check ride in it, so it was quite impressive. Next slide. And I'll let Connie talk about this one.
Like I said before about this picture, that's Shelley and I sitting in the Gulfstream when I first started flying, and Shelley was flying also. We actually let her fly in the right seat of our Gulfstream, so I got to fly with her. And you can see we're standing on the steps of the Gulfstream, so it's a significantly larger airplane than I was used to, but I've been flying that one almost as long as I was flying in the Air Force. I guess my story's next.
Yes.
Next slide. Well, I was raised in an Air Force family. My dad was an Air Force pilot, and my mom was an educator. She was an English teacher in college. And we traveled around a lot when I was growing up, and then the only thing I ever wanted to be was a nurse. And so when I got old enough, went to college, I went to the University of Texas, graduated as a nurse, went into the Air Force because I couldn't stand not having an ID card, and told the Air Force I needed to go someplace where they had a lot of young, eligible men. So they, well, I just wanted you to know that, the decision was not significant at that time. what do college graduates really know? So they assigned me to Williams Air Force Base, where, as of course, I met my dashing young husband who had just gotten back from Vietnam, and a couple of years later we were married. Then we moved to Randolph, and his job down there was in the education of pilots. And basically, when they came down, they said, the Air Force is going to train 10 women to be pilots. It's going to be a test program, and your office is assigned the job of figuring out if we could do this. So basically was, well, I don't think they can hold the brakes. Well, put Connie in the simulator, see if she can hold the brakes. Well, the boots aren't going to fit. Well, let her try on the boots. Well, the flight suits, they're all made for men. Let her try on the flight suits. So pretty soon I became kind of the guinea pig, although at the time I really was not ever thinking about being a pilot. That was never in my vision. And then Rich started coming up with this little idea, well, I really want to know how it's going to go. I mean, I know what they're going to tell me, but I want the inside scoop. And so he just kind of casually mentioned it one day, why don't you go to pilot training? And I was like, I'm a nurse. I'm not going to pilot training. He said, well, maybe you'll like flying. I said, well, maybe I will. He said, well, let's send you off to get a private pilot's license. So the first day I go out, it was a T-38 instructor in a light airplane at the Aero Club. I'm dressed in all white, it was raining outside. And he actually made me fuel the airplane, where I got dirty, and I wasn't really excited. So when I saw Rich, he said, he didn't ask me if I liked it. He said, did you get to do a takeoff? I said, yeah. Well, did you get to do any turns? Yes. Well, when are you going to fly again? Well, I had made the decision to schedule a flight, even though I wasn't exactly going to keep it, because I really wasn't excited about it. But he didn't ask me that, and so I kept the second one, and then I kept the third one, and pretty soon I was at solo, and all of a sudden I was sparked. I was caught. And I began to really think about whether or not I wanted to do this. So we spent a lot of time in prayer about that. And pretty soon we really felt like God wanted us to do this. And so I went ahead and finished up, got my pilot's license. And we turned in my application, took a 172, flew it from Texas all the way to California to get me a little extra time. And I'll never forget, we were on final at El Paso in this light airplane. And of course, to me, a pilot was a pilot. It was a pilot. You talk the language and you can fly anything, right? No, but at that time, I didn't know that. So we're on final, and the winds were terrible. And on short final, I just threw up my hands and said, you got it. Well, he hadn't flown a 172 since, I don't know, years. He was pretty mad at me. First lesson, take responsibility and do what you've been trained to do. And, don't be a girl at the time and throw up your hands and say, I can't do it, or start crying or whatever. The things that I had been trained as a woman to do. And to rely on men, my father, and I wasn't as independent as I needed to be. So there were a lot of hurdles to get me into pilot training and through pilot training. I know my husband was very supportive. There were a lot of days he kicked me out of bed and said, go run. He didn't go run with me. He'd just say, go run. Or he'd drive along beside me in his Porsche as I was running and say, you can do it, you can do it. True.
All true.
So, and as Mark had said, when I first came in the Air Force, there were only nurses and public affairs officers. There were no other women in the service except the civilian secretaries. And so there weren't bathroom facilities designed for a bunch of women. There weren't, it was just a real all-male world. So can I flip through these?
Just say next.
Next slide. This was the first airplane we flew. It was a T-37. It takes JP4 and turns it into noise. And so everybody had to wear big earmuffs, and it was just a very squealy, loud airplane. But the instructor sat right next to the student, and if you did anything wrong, he'd reach over and grab your oxygen mask, and he'd shake your face and say, listen to me. So when we got into the T-38, that wasn't true because the instructor was way in the back seat, and he couldn't do anything except yell. So But as we got through pilot training, I noticed when we first got in there, there were 10 women, and there in the squadrons that we were in, they had been there ever since my father was a pilot in Phoenix. And so the squadrons were designed in a men's atmosphere. So next slide. So here we had 10 women getting ready to fly the T-38. Next slide. And this was one of the flight rooms that had been there. This was the Playboy Bunny, and it was called Tipper. And we found out after we graduated from pilot training that Playboy thought that was pretty cool, and so they put our picture in Playboy magazine with these patches on. Thought that would be good advertisement. Next slide.
I was a tipper when I was a student at Williams.
This was my flight. This was beer can. And you can see all the wall was completely stacked up beer cans, and then they had a picture of the Clydesdales walking along the side of the room. And I won't tell you all the other stories, but basically it was a male environment. And these guys were not excited about having 10 women there. There were 39 guys in my class, and those 39 guys were the last guys to graduate from the academy as seniors before the first class of women came in. And so they were pretty proud that they were the last all-male guys, only to show up and find out there were 10 women in their class. So it was, we were really trying to figure out how do we win over these guys. Well, all of us were older than the guys because we were all captains, had been in the service before, most of us. And so Rich just made the comment one day, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. And I thought, how can we use that? And so I talked the girls into making cookies. And so on Friday, we brought cookies in, and the guys kind of looked at us, but they ate them all. And by the third or fourth week, guys were making cookies and bringing them in, and they were our best friends. And so we turned into a really nice family. We helped each other. We studied with each other. And we really got along well. That was not true for all the women. We were divided into two different groups. There were 5 of us on one side and 5 of us on the other. And I've noticed even years later when we talk to some of the gals, they have real bitter memories of going through pilot training and going out into the Air Force. That was just not true for me. For me, it was just a really great experience. Next slide. There was a lot of publicity associated with the first 10 women. The guys back at Randolph got our grade books every single day. They, if somebody busted a check ride, they wanted to know exactly why. And of course, most of the guys and some of the instructors thought, well, they're just pushing the women through because they don't want them to fail. Well, that's true when you train a pilot and you're paying $1 million for them. You don't want anybody to fail. But, because we were women, that was because, she passed because she was a woman as opposed to she passed because whatever. So there was a lot of publicity, and so they really came down and said, we will have one day in 37s, one day in 38s, where we'll let the press come in. And so the guys got a day off, and the girls had to go down there and have pictures taken and everything. But other than that, they pretty much left us alone. Next slide. There was a couple of artists that came through and actually did paintings, which have shown up all over the Air Force in the Air Force Art Collection, where they actually document history. And you can actually go online and see any kind of history anywhere. And if a guy would paint it, they would send him TDY somewhere to take pictures or whatever, and then he would paint it and donate it. And they've got an amazing collection of art. Next slide. When we graduated, there were 10 women and 22,000 men in the Air Force flying airplanes. And so each of us, where we were going to go, were going to be the only one. Of course, I came back to Willie. Everybody knew me, so it was pretty easy for me. Until we had brand new students that came in and asked for IP changes because they didn't want the woman. But for the gals that went out into the regular Air Force, like in the C-130, they didn't really have bathroom facilities on the airplane, so they would find, one gal said they hung up a pink shower curtain for her to kind of section off that area. On the side of my airplane, they wrote my name in pink. The guys used to call me Mom. These things were all not politically correct today, but it was part of the culture at the time. And you could either get offended by it and get your shackles up and act like it was a terrible thing, or you could just smile and let it roll off your back. And whenever we had criticism, I would always look at the criticism or the comment, and I'd say, well, is this true or not? If it was true, I would change. If it was not true, I'd just forget about it. And I think that that's really true for anything today, wherever you go. When somebody criticizes you or says something ugly about you, it's not your responsibility to judge that, other than how it affects you. And then your response is your responsibility. What they say is their responsibility. So that carried me through a lot as we graduated and went around the Air Force. Next slide. This is up at the Wright-Patterson Museum right now. This is the dedication of the 10 women flight suits that came from where we all dedicated or gave those to them so they could put it in there. And they've got a whole section on women pilots and what has happened since us. But interestingly enough, from God's perspective, when Rich and I first graduated, when I first graduated, Rich was flying a T-38 also, and we were allowed to take the T-38 and travel to get our flight time, our proficiency flight time. And so we actually came here to Colorado Springs one time, and we met with Jim Irwin. And he told us something that just absolutely, for me, set my life. He said, you know, God's given you a platform to speak about Jesus. And so, you know, he didn't really make you a pilot just to make you a pilot. You've got a platform. And so Rich and I took that to heart, and we spoke at the Billy Graham Crusade. We were on the PTL Club. We went to just a lot of places where churches would ask us to come speak, and we were always able to share our faith during that time. Things have changed a lot now, but at the right time, at the right place, God just gave us that ability to do that. Next slide. We eventually went to Edwards, and that was where I spent the rest of my career. My desire, once I decided to fly, was to fly the T-38. I really never wanted to fly anything else. To me, flying the T-38, like my husband flew the T-38, was all I really wanted to do. And I spent the next, 25 years before I actually retired from the reserves. I spent at Edwards flying the T-38 and met lots of great people that were role models for us. This is General Yeager. He used to come out there, and he taught me something about encouraging people that were coming up behind you. He used to come out and talk to all the new test pilots, and he would tell them about his experiences, and they would get so excited. And you know, he would just take the time to do that. And I got to fly with him a couple of times, and his stories were just amazing. They're all written in his books, but we just really were excited about that. And I realized that a lot of times we would have people that would come up and say, you know, I remember you did this, or you did this, or you said this to me. And we would think, gosh, I don't even remember saying that. But it just made us more sensitive to encouraging people or finding somebody to mentor in where you've been. And that's at any age. You know, if you've got a private pilot's license and somebody's just starting, I don't care if you're 16, you can share something with that person that's going to make a difference. Next slide. Well, this was my first daughter, Lindsay, and you saw her as a lieutenant colonel. And we have 3 daughters. You've seen all 3 of them. And after the second daughter was born, I got out of the active duty Air Force and went into the reserves, and God opened the door so that I could fly a T-38 1 day a week instead of 5 days a week, doing exactly the same job. And I did that until I retired. And so I was able to homeschool for 4 days a week. On the 5th day, on the Wednesday when I went to work, I had a lady that come in and taught my daughters about home ec and sewing, and you know, it was just a great thing that God opened that door for us. Next.
And I was even periodically a substitute instructor.
That's true. That's true. Because wherever we lived, and at some point we came to the East Coast, and we kind of moved down the East Coast through Eglin, I would fly back. And God would work it out so I could get my 5 sorties in a couple of days. I would fly 3 times a day and a night sortie for 2 days, and then I would fly home. Rich was a wing commander at Eglin at the time, and yet he was still able to homeschool the girls and take care of them while I was gone.
Ranch dressing dinners, my favorite. Real easy, just ranch dressing and little vegetables.
Cut up vegetables. They still like it. I got to do a lot of exciting things out at Edwards. If you have an open cockpit in Edwards and you want to jump into it, most of the time they would let us do that. And so I flew in amazing number of airplanes, not near as many as my husband. But I was always the back seater. But as a chase pilot in the T-38, we would fly along with F-16s, F-15s, C-17s. I chased the A-10 when it was doing the gun testing, and they would always take a T-38 along with them in this big sky out there so that we could clear for other airplanes and call out any dangers that they had. And so that's basically what I did for the next 10 years, and it was really thrilling. Next slide. But not so much as the Gulfstream. When I retired from the Air Force, I didn't fly for 5 years while I was homeschooling the girls, and then all of a sudden, Dr. Fred Price out in California called and said, I'm getting a Gulfstream. Would you and Rich like to fly it? So Rich, and he'll tell you a little bit why he didn't later, but I said, well, I don't know. Maybe I would like to do that, because I was thinking about going back and get my nursing degree upgraded. So I went out, took a trip with him, and I was hooked. So he sent me to school, and I began to fly for him. And over the years, I've flown for that Pastor Price. And then I flew for my pastor in Maryland. Now I'm flying out of Chicago for Dr. Bill Winston. I've taken Kenneth Copeland over to Nigeria. And we fly around the world. Now, until COVID, I would have 2 or 3 round-the-world trips, or 2 or 3 international trips a year. They're about 50 hours each. We would take off, say, from Chicago, go to Helsinki, get some gas, end up in India, over to Sri Lanka, over to Singapore, Fiji Islands, Hawaii, and then back to Chicago. And each place we would stop, they would preach, hold meetings. Dr. Winston has a school of businesses, Christian school of businesses that he started all over the world. And so now it's really exciting for me. That is my ministry, to be able to take him wherever he needs to go. And we go to South America. We've been all over Africa. And that was one thing Shelley did, too, that she didn't mention, but at some point, Shelley went over to Uganda to an orphanage over there, and she taught in their school for 2 months, and she taught aviation. And she had all these pictures for them, and they made paper airplanes, and it was really exciting. So there's just a lot of things you can do in aviation that you don't have to be the pilot. You can, be the instructor or whatever. So next slide. I think that's it. Yeah.
Okay, that's the famous one in the family. I'm just going to tell you this anecdotal stories quickly about what I did. Born in Los Angeles, California. Parents moved to San Francisco and then ultimately to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I became a cheesehead. I still am today. After graduated from high school in Wisconsin, I went to Texas A&M in College Station, Texas. And at the time, A&M had mandatory ROTC. And you had to choose what you wanted to do because the Cadet Corps, this was really a sucker story. I remember visiting A&M and the guy says, you really need to come back in the fall. It's different. I went there in the summer, and of course there were no cadets in uniform. And when I came back, it was like a military school. Everyone was wearing uniforms. So I got to A&M, and I had to choose what ROTC I wanted to be in. I didn't aspire to be in the military at all, but the Air Force line was shorter, so I went in the Air Force. And then after I was about into my cadet program at A&M, cadet instructor, one of the instructors came up to me and said, you really ought to be a pilot. It only takes 1 more year to be a pilot, and you find it to be a fun experience. So I wrote this letter asking to get on the pilot program of ROTC. And in the letter I said what I wanted to do, what I aspired to do, was to be a test pilot. I was pursuing a degree in engineering, so that seemed logical to me. And that has indeed been what happened. Richly blessed. God's opened up doors for me, and some of it is related to being her wingman that really got me into Air Force Test Pilot School. But after I graduated from pilot training, I flew the same airplanes Connie did, the T-37, T-38, the T-41 was the screener. I went to fly the A-1 Skyraider in Vietnam. Next slide. The A-1 is a beast. I mean, there's really no comparison to it. I think it's called sometimes the last prop fighter. That engine produces about 2,800 horsepower. It has 18 cylinders arranged in 2 circular arrangements of 9 cylinders each. Think about a V8. Okay, this was a V18, or a radial V18, and it was a beast. Next slide. I was stationed at Nakhon Phanom in Thailand with the 22nd Special Operations Squadron, which was the Zorros. We did night missions. We would go out on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and roll in and try and strike trucks. And it was so primitive. We had a fixed pipper sight, which means we had a single depressed sight on the pipper. We would roll in at a certain altitude, wait till we got a certain speed. Hopefully the pipper was on the target. We'd push a button and ordnance would go away, and we'd hopefully do something more than kill a bunch of monkeys in the trees in Laos. I did have one very eventful sortie in the A1. And there's a little moral principle behind this. I've been flying principally the H model, which is the one you see in the picture, which is the single-seat version. The Air Force also had the E model, which was what we call the family model. It had a side-by-side cockpit, and it could take actually 6 people in the back for medical reasons. The armament panel was the same between the two, and I was out at night. Switches may have been just a little bit different from physically where you'd imagine them because of the H and the E. And we had what we call funny bombs. They were thermite bombs on one of the stub stations. If you look at it, you can see this particular picture has wing tanks on it, but we had stub stations. So I flipped the switch to arm one of the stub stations, rolled in at night, rolled out, diving down, ready, pickle. Pulled the nose up, boom, I hear a thud, engine quits. And there's AAA flying through the sky because we were over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and they were shooting at us. So that was very disconcerting. Hours and hours of boredom interrupted by moments of stark terror. Well, that was a stark terror moment. But I quickly reached down and figured out that I needed to go to the internal fuel tank. When I did, the engine started, and I sheepishly told the leader that I was a little bit low on gas, and because I had pickled my fuel tank. I had dropped the fuel tank down instead of the bomb, and the forward air controller said, hey, Zorro, I think you hit something. There's a fire down there. Yeah, I didn't want to tell him it was just my gas tank. So I turned around and came home. But the moral of the story was know your cockpit and know where the switches are, because a lot of cockpits look the same, but they're different. Connie flies a Gulfstream 4, but even the various versions of the G4 are different. She also flies a Gulfstream 5, and the 5 cockpit is different than the 4 cockpit. And when I got to Edwards, of course, no 2 cockpits were ever the same, but it is really a different kind of world. After that, after the A1, as Connie said, we went back to Williams. She went through pilot training, went to school, and then I came back to Edwards as an instructor in the test pilot school. Next slide. And I'll just talk quickly about what I did at Edwards. As a test pilot, after my time in the school, I went to fly in what was known as a Lantern program, low altitude targeting infrared for night. It was a 2-pod system put on the F-16 we developed it on the F-16, one of which was a terrain following radar, and the other one was a targeting pod that would laze a target on the ground, and then the bomb would go to where the laser was. The Air Force had developed precision munitions as a result of the difficult time, I would say almost impossible time we had in dropping bombs in Southeast Asia. And it was a technological explosion to my head to go from a fixed pipper diving down in the A1 to a computer-driven, forward-looking infrared targeting pod that lased the ground, and then the bomb went right where the laser spot was. Radical difference. In the Lantern program, it was a new program, and it was the first time the Air Force had really pursued doing a lot of night work. And so, as is typical of a program at Edwards, when you're doing something that's a little controversial or different, you have a lot of VIPs who want to come out and see what you're doing. So we put together a Lantern VIP sortie, which would give someone who came to visit Edwards the ability to see what we were doing. We had a few of the airplanes, F-16s in the test program were 2-seaters. So we could put the VIP in the back, and then the test pilot could fly it in the front. And because we did it at night, we'd bring him over to the squadron. My beautiful wife would prepare some food for him. We'd have dinner. We'd talk about what we were going to do. And then when we were through, we'd go out and get in the airplane, go fly. I won't go through all the details of that Lantern sortie, but I want to talk about a couple elements of it. First of all, this is really what was cool. We would take off from Edwards, and instead of climb, we would descend. We descend down to 200 feet for automatic terrain following and go into what was known as the Panamint Valley, a valley to the northeast of Edwards Air Force Base. And the terrain following radar had a mode called VLC, very low clearance. The radar, instead of scanning like this, would scan right in front of you, so you had restrictions on bank angles and things like that. But we would go into Panamint Valley, we'd enter the VLC mode, and we would descend to 100 feet above the ground at night, flying off infrared. And it was not automatic terrain following, it was manual. The test pilot was flying it. And we would tell our guests to look over to the side, and if they looked over to the side, you could see the strobe light reflected off the ground. That's how low you were. And we'd go screaming down the Panama Valley at about 420 to 480 knots. And there was a road that went through that valley, and cars would drive on that road. And the cars, because of the slope of the valley, the cars were actually higher than the aircraft was. So you would look out the side of the aircraft and you'd see a car above you. I can only imagine what the drivers of those cars thought when a screaming airplane goes down with strobe lights and position lights on. But after we did that, we would go into the mountains, Sierra Nevada mountains, and we'd use a terrain following radar at a higher setting, 200 feet, and we would fly up and over mountain peaks and through valleys. It was just an incredibly, phenomenally impressive system. And then we'd come back to Edwards, and we would go to the bombing range, and we would drop some kind of a inordinate what am I trying to say? Yeah, ordnance that didn't blow up, whatever that is. And, and we'd come back to land. And the landing was every bit as impressive part of the flight as anything else. We would instruct the tower to shut off all the lights at Edwards Air Force Base, all the runway lights. Runway lights, taxi lights would all be shut off. We would turn off all of our exterior lights. So the airplane was completely dark, the F-16 was, and the runway was completely dark. We would use the instrument landing system to help us guide down, which is typically designed for instruments. And it has a ceiling typically of about 200 feet. We would go down to the instrument landing system, and we had a good radar altimeter, and we knew the field, obviously, because we tested there. And just as we approached over the overrun, we'd use the radar altimeter, and we would cut the pitch in half. We'd go from 5 degrees, nose low for the ILS, to 2.5. We'd bring the throttle straight up and start bleeding the airspeed, and slowly hold the airplane off, and it would touch down on the runway. So blacked out airplane, no landing lights, blacked out runway, we would touch down. And we put the nose down, and then we'd throttles to idle, pull the brakes out, and put the speed brakes out, and go ahead and slow it up. The next thing that happened was really cool to the passenger. It was a little bit of a false set of circumstances. We would say, Tower, Lantern 1, would you please turn the lights on? And they'd turn the lights on. Of course, you'd see you're right in the middle of the runway. You'd see the taxi lights would come up, the runway lights would come up, and then we would taxi off the airplane and taxi it back to the squadron. The truth is, we could not have turned that airplane off the runway. The forward-looking infrared system was about this big, directly in front of you. We had no idea what was off to the side, okay? Edwards has got a 300-foot wide runway, so, we weren't worried about that. But we really could never have taxied back without the lights coming back on. So we could land in the dark, but we had to taxi with the lights. Next slide. Towards the end of my tour at Edwards, National Aeronautics and Space Administration gave me a tremendous opportunity. As Connie said, pilots flew qualitative evaluation of various airplanes all the time. They gave me the opportunity to do one of those flights in an SR-71. NASA had at least 3 SR-71s, one of which was the B model with the bulbed back seat so the IP could see. And I went through a couple simulators with NASA, and then this particular picture you're seeing is us getting out of the crew van, which we would breathe 100% oxygen before we went out and fly. We flew the SR-71 in full pressure suits. Next slide. That's me getting strapped into the airplane. I was in the front, and Smiling Eddie from NASA was in the back seat, and physiological training people were making sure both of us were in the airplane correctly. Next slide. This is the takeoff, and that F-18 chase you see that's chasing me, that was Connie chasing me. She showed you the picture earlier of her with a NASA test pilot. Well, those two were chasing me in the SR-71, and they chased me for part of the mission. There was a certain point where even that Mach 2 F-18 couldn't keep up with the SR, and we charged and went off and did our thing. I think I got to slightly over 80,000 feet, about Mach 3 plus in the SR-71. Next slide. Came back and landed, and the landing was uneventful. SR's got a drag chute, and it was just a phenomenally impressive and fun flight. I'll tell you one little story about having vision, and this again is, God opens doors for you, and you should never doubt that. When I was a cadet at Texas A&M, which is 25 years probably before that picture was taken, I had two airplanes that were hung in my dorm room. One of them was an SR-71, one of them was a U-2. I wanted to fly those. I thought those are cool airplanes. I also thought the intelligence business was kind of cool. I flew the U-2 as a student in test pilot school. I went up to Beale Air Force Base, got an opportunity to fly the U-2. And NASA, just before these airplanes were retired for good, gave me a flight in the SR-71. So that vision from 25 years ago was realized with both of those airplanes. And then, when I left the Air Force, I went to work in the intelligence community, initially with the Central Intelligence Agency, and ultimately with the Director of National Intelligence for another 20 years. So I really got to do a lot of neat stuff. And being a her wingman, of course, was just absolutely the neatest. Now, this family flies, not afraid of heights, obviously, 80,000 feet, Mach 3. We have one member of the family who has somehow got the bug for heights. Probably never going to be a pilot. Next slide, please. This is our cat on top of a weight machine trying to get into a hole we'd put in the ceiling because we were doing some work in the basement. I think the cat's confused, thinks he's a goat or something, but nonetheless, always climbs up high, going for high places. And then the picture on the lower right is the cat sitting on top of a bed that was stood up in a room while we were doing some maintenance on it. We nicknamed for this guy as Rascal. He is a rascal. He's really got rascallian behavior. Next slide. Okay, a few concluding thoughts. Next slide. It doesn't make a lot of difference, it should not, what you're led to go do. If you're led by God to go do something, go do it. It could be a small airplane as an instructor, as Shelley talked about, or it could be the Gulfstream that's behind the diamond there that Connie flies. It's important you know where you're called, and that's what you go do. And you should never doubt in yourself when you've put your hands around that calling, and don't be surprised when doors open up. Do not be surprised when doors open up. Next slide. So aviation and flying and being pilots, that's all cool. But, and I think the Air Force certainly taught me this, you must appreciate that it's not just the pilot who makes it happen. These were my crew chiefs for the F-16 that I flew at Edwards, and those guys are really phenomenal. They went out there and busted their knuckles to make sure the airplane was ready for me to fly. And the maintenance people that work on the Gulfstreams and every airplane are top-notch. And it's not just pilots and maintenance. Air traffic controllers, as Shelley talked about, her part of her aviation career was at aviation management, which is obviously very important to dispatchers, tower operators. They're all part of the team that makes aviation possible. And you may be the pilot, but don't forget the other people in the process that really allow it to happen. Okay, one final comment. I mean, both of my daughters talked a little bit about thoughts, recommendations for being a pilot. This may seem a little strange, but the one that I would give you is you really got to keep your nose clean. It is such a selective process that people who either have drug problems or arrest problems or alcohol problems have a difficult time sustaining a career in aviation. your moral character is very important. People are going to trust you. They're going to trust you with their lives. And so you really have to be trustworthy. And by the way, it's not just the pilot. Every time I get in that F-16, I count on those gentlemen to make sure that airplane's ready for me to go fly. One more story. We did an exchange with the Russians when I was at Edwards. They came to Edwards and flew our airplanes, and we went to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, and we got to fly some of their airplanes. And I'll never forget what the Russian general said to me. He made two observations about his visit to Edwards. One, he said, "You won the Cold War because of this lake bed." And he pointed at the dry lake bed at Edwards, where we could test everything, all the X-15 and all the experimental airplanes flew. And he said, "I could not believe you had enlisted people start your airplanes or be your crew chiefs." Because in their Air Force, all of that was done by officers. In our Air Force, all of it is done by enlisted people. That's because the quality of people we have is so good. And honorable profession, but very, very good. Okay, next slide. Okay, time for questions. The beautiful wife's going to answer all the tough ones. Thank you very much.
Actually, it was the other way around. I really felt like we were treated so that we would succeed. Some of the women didn't think that, but you know, if I had been running a test program, I was in charge of it, I would do everything I could to make sure that they succeeded, because the Navy had already trained women, you know, and the Air Force didn't want to take a back door, and they still called it a test program, so they still had an out. You know, we had 10 women that came in when we did, and then 10 women the next year, and then they cut it off for about 3 years while they kind of studied it. So they had an out, they knew, but they didn't want to look bad. So, you know, did they give some of the women extra rides? Yes. Did they give some of the guys extra rides? Yes. I feel like the guys in our class actually got extra training because of us, because they didn't want to say, you know, we're giving her extra, but not him. So I just, and of course my greatest cheerleader was right here, you know, so I was never real concerned. I didn't have the identity problems maybe that some of the other women did. So my story is really very different than some of their stories. But, you know, if somebody commented on my hair after I took my helmet off, you know, I would realize that my husband thought I was beautiful, so I didn't care what they thought, you know. But if there was nobody at home to tell you that you're still beautiful, you know, then that ugly hair might have just really affected your self-esteem.
So do you remember your arrow? Could you tell them how a wing produces lift?
Yeah, well, this was another reason. You know, studying aerodynamics for me as a nurse was pretty tough. And so Rich had been an instructor before, so he would say, okay, here's a wing. Now they're a bunch of little guys, and they come running across the top, and then some of them come running across the bottom, and they meet at the other side. And so that's how he explained aero to me. Well, then I would go to my class, and I would tell the guys, hey, you know, little guys running over the wings. And they probably thought I was nuts, but, you know, hey, yeah, it worked. I remember when we got ready to graduate, we had to line up in formation. Well, as a nurse, you never do that. We didn't go through OTS. We went on a direct commission where you come in and they give you 3 weeks and tell you who to salute and how to wear your hat, and that's about it. And so I wasn't supposed to be in charge of this, you know. So everybody's, and all these guys are academy guys. They know how to do all this, you know, but they're walking around and wandering around, and I'm sitting there going, gosh, what are we going to do, you know? And finally, when they said to line up, all of a sudden, they're all lined up. And then they said, you stand there and do this and say this. And I was like, okay. And it all worked. So they were great. Yes, ma'am. My favorite part about flying. I think the things that you see when you're up above the clouds, when you're down here and it's raining and gloomy, sometimes you feel a little gloomy. But the minute you break through those clouds and you're up there and you see bright blue sky and you see clouds, it just makes me feel closer to God. Kind of the, who has touched the sky poem, it's a transcending experience. And that's the part I like probably the best. The part I don't like is trying to come back down through the clouds and land when it's snowing and there's snow all over the place and you can't see in front of you. Then I have to work.
And it's windy.
And the winds are coming from the side, and then I have to work really hard. I was just up in Chicago this last week, and it was snowing, and the wind was blowing, and it was at night, and I had to work really hard. But it also teaches you something about faith, because when you're coming down through those clouds and you can't see the runway, and you're just coming down, you're getting closer and closer and closer to the ground, and you break out at 100 feet and touch that airplane down, you have faith in those instruments, and that teaches you something about what God says. I learned a lot about faith from flying.
Yes, sir. Out of all of which hours? Combat hours. Dropping my fuel tank was certainly exciting. We did a mission kind of early in my tour, which was also very, very rewarding. We had I'll tell you 2 missions. We had a target that was in a valley, and there were clouds that went over the mountains in the valley. So we had to kind of descend, kind of using our very inaccurate navigation equipment down through the clouds and get underneath the clouds to fly and attack the target. And we were, I think we were dropping 500-pound bombs at that time. We were so low to the ground when we dropped the bombs. When the bombs came off the airplane and they exploded, there was a concussion. We could feel the concussion in the back of the airplane. I said, "Oh, that's cool." The guy next to me was white. He said, "That's not cool." So that was a very interesting mission. The other one that I said I will never forget was we supported the Army's long-range reconnaissance units, special forces that were inside either Vietnam or Laos. In this particular case, it was Laos. And they were in that country with mercenaries for all practical purposes. And there was a case where there was an open field, and the special Green Berets and their team were under attack. And we came in the A1s, and they said, put it on the north edge of the field, or north edge of the grassy area. And it was such a small area, I said to myself, I can't guarantee where these bullets are going to come from this 20-millimeter gun. And I'll never forget the guy on the radio says, "I don't care, just shoot." So I did my very best to come in there and shoot at the side of the opening that he wanted me to. And these guys were crazy. What I found out later on is, as I was shooting, they were standing up and shooting the other guy. They were taking advantage of the cover to go ahead and shoot. But that was the intimacy, I should say, of the support that we tried to give the ground forces.
I love your story. Thank you so much for being here. I had a couple of questions, but one of them, has it ever been real difficult to see all of your years throughout? Well, now you have this perspective with God's perspective that He's given you, and I really love that. Was there ever a time throughout the years where it was just
Absolutely. I mean, like Rich said, he took the short line. He certainly didn't know God wanted him in the Air Force, and there were a lot of obstacles that we went through. And during those times, when you go through difficult times, a lot of times we draw closer to God and ask, questions. And so along the way, we would get guidance, but there were some very difficult times. There was one time, I'll tell your story, they called Rich in at Edwards and said, "We don't have any jobs for you here. You're going to have to go find your job somewhere else." And so, obviously that would be very disconcerting to a test pilot that, wanted to stay at Edwards and be a test pilot and do exciting testing. So over the years, we just started talking to God and believing God for what he had for us. And I'll get back to that in just a second. The other thing was, a lot of criticism came to me from the Christian community, more so probably than from the secular community. There was a big write-up about me going through pilot training in Moody Monthly. My mother wrote a book about my experiences, and the backlash from that about why would a Christian woman be doing that was pretty radical. And so, I would find myself saying, wow, what am I doing? And second-guessing what I was doing. But then as I began to realize that God opened the doors for me to homeschool kids, gave me a job where I was working 1 day a week instead of 5. And then Rich ended up not only going back to Edwards, but he was the wing commander of one Eglin Air Force Base, which is one test community down in Florida. Then he went to be the wing commander at Edwards, and then he went to be the center commander at Edwards. So he got the 3 best jobs in the test community that there were. And yet, at the time, we didn't know that. So, yes, some of the times were hard, but we just chose to trust God, maybe not knowing which door he was going to open, but trusting that he'd open it.
We can't thank you enough. We have so much. All of us have so much respect for you and for Lindsay and for Shelley if you're out there. And Lindsay, thanks for putting us all together, because none of this would have happened except for you. But wow, I was on the other side of the fence. I was one of the instructors that had to get the grade books to Randolph. I was single, because I didn't meet Debbie till much later. And they had a rule. They were trying to make it work so well in the Air Force. They had a rule that none of us single guys could go out and back or cross country with the women. It had to be married men. The wives didn't like it. So one day, one of the ladies was way behind in her timeline, and they called me up and said, "Hyatt, we're desperate. We need you to go to Albuquerque with this lady, and you're going to be the first single guy that ever has flown with one of these women." No, it was so weird. I mean, the Air Force, yes, they were trying to set everything up. They wanted everything to go perfect for these ladies, and I did my best. And but no, she didn't hear any stories. Yeah. But when we were at Albuquerque, of course, we had a maintenance problem, had to spend the night, and so when we went to the bar, everything was free. Nothing to do with me. It had to do with the lady I was with, because she was wearing a flight suit, and everybody says she was eating and drinking for free. So I said, well, hey, I'm the instructor. What do I get? Anyway, and then the last thing I'll say is that I've done some research about the safety when there's a woman at the controls, and nothing against us guy pilots, but over 100,000 hours, if you do the longitudinal analysis, there are slightly fewer fatalities when a woman is at the controls. So my motto is fly like a girl. Okay, I've got some shirts for the 4 of you, Lindsay, Shelley. If you need different sizes, they're AeroLab shirts, and we just can't thank you enough, and I salute you both. And Connie, thank you. So,
I want to thank Steve and Sarah for putting all this together and helping us. We never could have pulled this off. And I knew it took all kinds of technological magic at the end to make that happen. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. They'll be around if you want to come up, shake their hands, get their autographs. What an amazing couple.